Human bought an abandoned cabin for scraps, only to discover an alien widow chained beneath it. The truck's suspension groaned as Jacob Moss navigated the final stretch of overgrown road, branches scraping against rusted metal like fingernails on bone. Pine needles littered the cracked windshield, and through them he caught his first glimpse of the cabin, a sagging structure of weathered timber that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. Perfect. Nobody would bother him here. He killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, hands still gripping the steering wheel. 3 years since he'd stopped checking his phone for messages that would never come. 3 years since he'd learned that all the training in the world couldn't protect the people you loved from a patch of black ice and a guardrail that gave way like paper. The mountains didn't care about his grief. That was why he'd come. Jacob grabbed his pack from the passenger seat and stepped out onto Earth that hadn't felt human footsteps in months, maybe longer. The auction listing had been sparse, estate sale, remote property sold as is for salvage value. The previous owner had been some hermit who died alone, no next of kin, no one to care what happened to his accumulated junk. Jacob had paid cash and asked no questions. The cabin door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, dust motes drifted through shafts of afternoon light, illuminating debris that spoke of abandonment. Overturned furniture, yellowed newspapers, the skeletal remains of a life lived in isolation. Jacob moved through the space with practiced efficiency, cataloging what might be worth salvaging. Copper piping in the walls, some decent hardwood under the rot. Nothing special. He was prying up floorboards in the main room when his crowbar struck something that wasn't wood. The sound rang hollow, metallic. Jacob cleared away more planks, revealing a hatch set into reinforced concrete, its surface scarred with rust and sealed with cobwebs thick enough to suggest years of neglect. Heavy-duty hinges. Military-grade lock mechanism, now corroded. His instincts hummed with warning, the kind that had kept him alive in places where asking questions got you killed. He should have left it alone. Should have walked away, found another property, continued his self-imposed exile somewhere less complicated. Instead, Jacob retrieved bolt cutters from his truck and spent 20 minutes working the lock until it gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. The hatch lifted on protesting hinges, exhaling air that tasted of earth and something else, something chemical and foreign. Stone steps descended into darkness. Jacob clicked on his flashlight and started down, each footfall echoing in a space that felt far larger than a simple root cellar. The beam swept across a chamber carved from bedrock, perhaps 15 feet on each side, the walls smooth and deliberately shaped. Equipment lined the perimeter, surveillance monitors, their screens dark, and what looked like medical instruments arranged on a rust-stained table. But it was the far wall that stopped Jacob's breath in his chest. A figure hung there, suspended by heavy alloy cuffs that bound both wrists and connected to chains anchored in the stone. Even in the inadequate light, Jacob could see this was no human skeleton left to rot. The being stood 7 feet tall, her frame simultaneously elegant and powerful, like a dancer built for combat. Her skin, what he could see of it, shifted between deep violet and sickly pale lavender, covered in places by form-fitting black armor that flickered with dying blue light. Her head lifted as his flashlight found her face. Large eyes, luminous even in their exhaustion, fixed on him with an intelligence that pierced through the shadows. Long white strands cascaded past her shoulders, dulled by filth but unmistakably alive, moving with a subtle current he couldn't identify. Pointed ears rose from the sides of her head, their purple gradient matching her skin. Behind her, something moved. A tail, he realized, coiling defensively around one leg as she tracked his approach. "Jesus Christ," Jacob whispered. The being's lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were almost human but not quite, and a sound emerged from her throat, harsh, guttural, nothing like any language he knew. Her four-fingered hands clenched into fists despite the restraints, and the chains rattled as she strained against them, her tail lashing with agitation. Jacob raised both hands, flashlight pointed at the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his training overrode panic. No sudden movements. Show you're not a threat. He took a slow step backward. The being's next words came in broken English, each syllable fighting through an accent that turned familiar sounds alien. "You leave now, let me die here, no more." Her voice carried layers of exhaustion and something deeper, a resignation that Jacob recognized from his own mirror. He'd heard that tone in his own voice in the months after the funeral when every morning felt like a negotiation with oblivion. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice level and low. "I didn't know anyone was down here. I just bought this property." She laughed, a bitter sound that rattled in her chest. "They all say, then they hurt, then they watch, always watching." Her eyes tracked past him to the surveillance equipment, and Jacob followed her gaze. The monitors were dead now, but he could imagine them glowing, recording, the hermit sitting up here for years, while this being suffered in the dark. The thought made his stomach turn. "How long have you been down here?" "Too long, lifetimes, your lifetimes, perhaps." She closed her eyes, her white hair dimming like dying embers. "Please, go, forget." Jacob should have climbed those stairs, should have called someone. Though who would he call? The authorities? And tell them what? Instead, he found himself saying words that surprised him with their certainty. "I'm going to get you out." Her eyes snapped open, narrowing with suspicion, and something that might have been hope trying desperately not to exist. Why? It was a fair question. Jacob didn't have a good answer, except that he'd spent 3 years punishing himself for failing to save the people he loved, and here was someone he might actually help. Someone trapped and helpless who didn't deserve whatever hell she'd been living through. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because I know what it's like to want to die." The being studied him with an intensity that felt like being dissected, her luminous eyes cataloging every detail of his face. Her tail slowly unwound from her leg, the tip curling and uncurling with uncertainty. "Jacob," he added, touching his chest. "My name is Jacob." She was silent for a long moment, then spoke with a formality that seemed carved from protocol and exhaustion. "Seraphine, I am called Seraphine." "All right, Seraphine, I'm going back upstairs to get water and food. Then we're going to figure out how to get those restraints off you. That acceptable?" Her expression shifted through emotions he couldn't name before settling on wary confusion. "You ask permission?" "Yeah, I ask permission." Seraphine's white hair brightened slightly, and the faintest warmth crept into her violet skin. When she spoke again, her voice carried less edge. "Then yes, it is acceptable." Jacob climbed the stairs, knowing everything had just changed, though he couldn't yet say how. 3 days passed in careful ritual. Jacob brought meals, water, medical supplies scavenged from town. He worked the restraints with hydraulic cutters while Seraphine held perfectly still, her tail coiled tight with anticipation. They spoke in fragments, her asking about seasons and sunlight, him learning that she'd been a xenobiologist before the crash that killed her crew. Before 17 years of captivity taught her that hoping was more dangerous than chains. When the final cuff cracked open, Seraphine's legs gave out immediately. Jacob caught her before she hit stone, her weight solid and warm against his chest. Her armor felt almost alive beneath his hands, pulsing with faint light as if responding to sudden freedom. "I have you," he said, and carried her upstairs into afternoon sun. She wept when natural light touched her skin for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Jacob set her on the spare room's mattress and watched her violet skin shift through warmer tones, watched her white hair drink in the illumination until it blazed like captured stars. Her tail extended toward the window, trembling. "I thought I would never see sky again," Seraphine whispered. "When my ship fell and Kelthrin died with the others, when that man found me in the wreckage, I believed death would be mercy." Jacob recognized the shape of that grief. He'd worn it himself after Emma and Sophie's accident, after waking to a world that felt permanently wrong. He sat on the mattress edge while Seraphine stared at clouds, and her tail found his wrist with surprising gentleness. "Your mate?" he asked quietly. "My mate, my crew, everyone." Her 4-fingered hand flexed against the blanket. "The Valwraith bond once in our long lives. When Kelthrin died, that part of me died also, so I believed." Over the following days, Jacob helped Seraphine relearn her body. They walked circuits through the cabin while her legs remembered their purpose. her hand gripping his shoulder when exhaustion hit. She asked endless questions about Earth, why humans kept photographs, how grief worked, what it meant that Jacob lived alone in the mountains, punishing himself for surviving. "You carry guilt as if the ice was yours to control," Seraphine said one evening while they prepared food together. Her movements were becoming steadier, more confident. "Kelthrin died because systems failed. Your family died because momentum and metal conspired beyond your power. Survival is not betrayal." Jacob's hands stilled on the vegetables he'd been cutting. Something in his chest loosened, just slightly, at hearing his own torment reflected back through alien perspective. "The Valwraith don't grieve?" he asked instead of responding. "We are taught that emotion clouds logic, that attachment creates vulnerability." Seraphine's skin shifted to warmer lavender, her tail swaying with what Jacob was learning meant uncertainty. "But I think perhaps my people have forgotten something important. Your emotion does not make you weak. I think it makes you brave." That night, they sat together on the couch, Seraphine explaining how her bio-armor was partially organic, grown with her body rather than worn. How her skin's color shifts betrayed feelings her species trained themselves to suppress. How her tail spoke truths that formal Valwraith protocol discouraged expressing. Jacob found his hand moving along her tail's length in an unconscious, soothing gesture. Seraphine's breathing deepened, her white hair brightening with something that might have been contentment. When she turned to look at him, her luminous eyes held questions neither of them knew how to ask yet. The helicopter shattered their careful peace 2 mornings later. Black and unmarked, it circled the cabin twice before banking away. Seraphine's armor snapped to full combat mode, blue patterns blazing as her entire body went rigid. "They come," she whispered. "Someone comes for me." Jacob watched the aircraft disappear beyond the ridgeline, his gut already knowing this was just reconnaissance. Someone had found the crash site. Someone knew she existed. "Your people are mine," he asked. "Does it matter? To them you are contaminated, a security risk. You should run, Jacob. Distance yourself before. I'm not leaving you to get chained up again." Seraphine's tail lashed with frustrated fear. "Then you are a fool." But that night, when she couldn't sleep, she came to find him on the couch. She sat close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, her tail extending across the cushions until Jacob's hand settled on it naturally. Her fingers found his and laced through them despite the awkwardness of 4 digits against 5. "I do not wish to be alone," she said quietly. "Then don't be." They stayed like that while moonlight painted shadows across the cabin walls. Seraphine's breathing gradually evened out against Jacob's shoulder, her white hair spilling across his chest. He felt the faint pulse in her bio-armor matching rhythm with his own heartbeat, and somewhere in the comfortable weight of her presence, he stopped cataloging escape routes long enough to simply exist. The emergency beacon woke them both near dawn, a high-pitched keen emanating from deep within Seraphine's armor that made Jacob's teeth ache. She jerked upright, confusion transforming to horror as she clutched at her chest where black material blazed with sudden light. "No, it cannot. The beacon was dormant, damaged." But the sound kept screaming, and Jacob already understood. 17 years of silence had just ended. Every sensor within range would now know exactly where to find them, and morning was still 2 hours away. Dawn broke with 3 black SUVs surrounding the cabin, their approach silent enough that Jacob only noticed when doors slammed in unison. Armed figures in tactical gear took positions behind vehicles and trees, weapons trained on the structure. A megaphone crackled to life before Jacob could reach for his pistol. "Jacob Moss, we know you're harboring the extraterrestrial entity. This is Thomas Meridian with Kepler Dynamics. You have 1 hour to surrender the asset peacefully. Comply and you'll be compensated for your cooperation." Seraphine stood at the window, her armor fully engaged in combat mode. Blue patterns traced her body like veins of lightning, and her tail moved in sharp, aggressive sweeps that spoke of readiness for violence. But her eyes held something closer to resignation. "You must give me to them," she said flatly. "They will kill you if you resist. I am not worth your death." Jacob checked his pistol's magazine out of habit, knowing it was useless against this kind of force. That's not your choice to make. Jacob, please. I said no. He moved to the kitchen and began pulling supplies. Water bottles, first aid kit, the hunting rifle from the closet. We barricade, we stall, we figure something out. There is nothing to figure. This is inevitable. But Seraphine's hands were already moving furniture, her Valwraith strength making easy work of the heavy couch Jacob struggled with. Her tail swept low, testing balance and reach as if her body remembered combat, training her mind insisted was futile. They worked in tense silence, reinforcing the door and covering windows. Jacob's mind cataloged options and found them all wanting. The cabin had no back exit, no tunnel, no miracle escape route. They had maybe an hour before Meridian's people came through the walls, and then what? Die together in a hail of bullets because Jacob couldn't accept the math of impossible situations? While searching for anything useful, Jacob found the hermit's journal wedged behind the water heater. Leather-bound, pages yellowed and filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, he flipped through entries describing the discovery of wreckage in the High Valley, the decision to investigate alone, the capture of an injured alien woman. The early pages documented almost scientific curiosity, measurements, observations, questions asked and never answered. But the tone shifted as months became years. The handwriting grew tighter, more paranoid. Descriptions of Seraphine's initial defiance giving way to broken compliance, details of removing her armor's offensive capabilities while she was sedated, of chains specifically designed to hold her strength, of how he'd convinced himself that keeping her hidden was protecting humanity from alien invasion. He was afraid, Jacob said, still reading. He thought you were the vanguard of some attack force, kept waiting for your people to come destroy everything. Seraphine's laugh was hollow. My people would have come if they could. We do not abandon our own. That they did not means they believed us dead, or could not locate the wreckage. She paused, her tail curling tight. Until now. The beacon changes everything. Vectar will come. Who's Vectar? My former colleague, commander of recovery operations. Her skin shifted to paler violet and her white hair dimmed slightly. He will retrieve me and eliminate all evidence of contact. That is protocol. You are evidence, Jacob. The megaphone crackled again. 40 minutes, Mr. Moss. We're not interested in violence, but we will breach if necessary. The asset is worth more alive than dead, but you're not. Jacob met Seraphine's eyes across the barricaded room. Her expression held too much acceptance, too much willingness to let herself become property again if it meant he survived. The same look she'd worn when he first found her in chains, asking him to let her die rather than prolong suffering. I can't do it, he said quietly. I can't hand you over to more chains, different building, same prison. Then what do you propose? We have no weapons that matter, no escape route, no... Jacob crossed the distance between them and took her four-fingered hands in his, feeling the warmth of her skin through her armor's partial retraction. We make them earn it. We make enough noise that when your people arrive, they can't pretend this didn't happen. You would die for principle. I'd die for you. The words came easier than he expected. 3 years I've been half dead anyway. At least this way it means something. Seraphine's skin blazed brilliant lavender, and her tail wrapped around his waist with fierce strength. She pressed her forehead to his, a gesture he'd learned meant intimacy among her people, her breath warm against his face. Your compassion has already changed me in ways the Valwraith would consider dangerous. You have shown me that feeling is not weakness, that attachment is not failure. Her voice dropped to something raw. I do not wish to lose you when I have only just learned to hope again. They kissed then, desperate and tender all at once. Her tail tightened around him while his hands tangled in her luminous hair, and for a moment the armed mercenaries and impossible odds ceased to exist. There was only this: 2 damaged souls refusing to accept that survival meant surrendering what they'd found in each other. Jacob pulled back first, forcing himself to focus. Help me rig the propane system. If they breach, we at least make them reconsider their risk assessment. They worked quickly, Seraphine's technical knowledge surpassing his crude demolitions training. She adjusted valves and redirected lines with precision that spoke of deep understanding of mechanical systems, her four-fingered hands moving with confidence. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman's voice, calm and professional, called through the reinforced wood. "Mr. Moss, I'm Dr. Amara Okafor. I'm unarmed and I'd like to talk. May I approach?" Jacob peered through a gap in the barricade. A black woman in tactical medical gear stood alone at the bottom of the porch steps, hands raised and empty. Her face carried lines of moral conflict that seemed genuine, but then again, so did most interrogators. "Talk from there," Jacob called back. "Meridian's giving you 30 minutes. After that, they're coming in hot." Okafor's voice carried quiet urgency. "I don't agree with this operation, but I'm here and I have medical supplies if you need them. I'm leaving a pack on the porch. Use them or don't, but please consider that dying for pride helps no one." She set down a tactical medical bag and retreated to the perimeter. Jacob retrieved it carefully, finding exactly what she'd promised. Bandages, antiseptics, field sutures. Real supplies, not a trick, a small mercy in a situation devoid of them. "Some of your people possess conscience," Seraphine observed, watching through a window gap. "That one does not wish to be part of my capture. But she'll stand by while it happens." Yes, conscience and courage are not the same. Seraphine's tail moved in a pattern Jacob couldn't interpret. "Jacob, I must tell you something. If Vectar arrives before Meridian breaches, you face equal danger. My people's protocols demand elimination of all witnesses to prevent contamination of first contact. You are witness, you are contamination. To Vectar, our connection will be evidence that I have been psychologically compromised." "Have you been compromised?" Her smile was sad and fierce at once. "Completely, wonderfully, I have learned to feel without shame, and I will not unlearn it, even if it costs me everything." The air above the property shimmered suddenly, and reality seemed to fold in on itself. A vessel materialized from nothing, sleek and organic in design, larger than the cabin, but smaller than the transport helicopters Jacob had worked around in his contractor days. The SUV's occupants scattered as the ship descended with perfect silence, landing in the clearing with barely a whisper of displaced air. A hatch opened in its hull and figures emerged, tall, violet-skinned, moving with lethal grace. At their head walked a male Valrith who stood 8 feet tall, his white hair cropped military short and his armor blazing crimson instead of blue. His tail moved in sharp, decisive gestures that needed no translation. Seraphine's breath caught. Meridian's voice came through the megaphone again, this time directed at the new arrivals. "This is human sovereign territory. Your presence constitutes—" Vectar made a dismissive gesture, and one of his team fired something that looked like compressed light. The megaphone exploded in Meridian's hands, and the message was clear. The Valwraith weren't here to negotiate. Vectar approached the cabin door, and his voice carried easily, despite speaking at normal volume. "Seraphine, you will emerge now. We have much to discuss regarding your prolonged absence and your apparent attachment to indigenous life." Seraphine's hand found Jacob's and squeezed tight, her tail wrapped around his arm in clear declaration. Whatever came next, they faced it together. Seraphine released Jacob's hand and moved to the door, dismantling their barricade with steady hands despite the tremor in her tail. Jacob started to protest, but she silenced him with a look that carried 17 years of survival instinct. "If I do not face him, he will simply come through the walls. Better to control the encounter." She glanced back at him, her white hair dimming with fear she couldn't quite suppress. "Stay behind me, please." Jacob positioned himself at her shoulder as she opened the door. Vectar stood on the porch, his 8-foot frame radiating controlled authority. His crimson armor pulsed with aggressive patterns, and his tail swept in sharp arcs that spoke of barely contained judgment. Behind him, 3 more Valwraith maintained perimeter positions, their weapons trained not on the cabin, but on Meridian's scattered forces. Vectar's luminous eyes swept over Seraphine, cataloging details with clinical precision. Her warmer skin tones, her partially retracted armor, the way she angled her body protectively in front of Jacob. His expression hardened into something between disappointment and disgust. He spoke in their language, rapid and harsh. Seraphine responded in English, her voice firm. We will speak so Jacob understands he has earned that respect. Respect? Vektar's English carried a heavier accent than Seraphine's, each word precisely formed. You defend the indigenous creature who has clearly compromised your conditioning. 17 years in captivity and you emerge displaying attachment behaviors, emotional volatility, skin pattern disruption consistent with uncontrolled bonding responses. His tail lashed once. You have been psychologically damaged beyond field recovery protocols. I have been freed, Seraphine corrected, and her tail rose to mirror his aggressive posture. By this human who asked nothing in return, who fed me, healed me, broke my chains when he could have walked away. Your protocols would name him contamination. I name him the first of your species to show me that emotion is not weakness but strength. Jacob watched Meridian's team repositioning at the perimeter, weapons now trained on the Valwraith. Thomas himself had retrieved a backup communicator and was speaking urgently into it, likely calling for reinforcements. The situation was powder waiting for a spark. Vektar's attention shifted to Jacob, assessing him with the same clinical detachment. You are the current property owner? I'm the one who found her chained in a basement, Jacob said evenly. The previous owner died months ago. She'd been down there for 17 years. Something flickered in Vektar's expression. Explain. So Jacob did, keeping his account factual and direct. The hermit's paranoia, the surveillance equipment, the restraints designed to hold Valwraith's strength, the journal documenting systematic psychological torture masked as scientific observation. He watched Vektar's tail movements shift from aggressive to disturbed as the scope of Seraphine's captivity became clear. This is not merely contamination, Vektar said slowly, more to himself than them. This is sustained trauma that would compromise any operative. His eyes found Seraphine again. Why did you not clarify the nature of your captivity immediately? Because I have learned not to trust that clarification matters, Seraphine replied, her voice carrying an edge Jacob rarely heard. Your protocols prioritize elimination of evidence over the welfare of the evidence itself. Whether I was captive or willing participant, the result remains the same. You would take me from the first being in 17 years who has treated me as a person rather than a specimen or a threat. A gunshot cracked across the clearing. One of Meridian's people had fired at a Valwraith soldier who'd moved too close to their position. The round deflected off alien armor with a spark of blue light, and suddenly the situation ignited. Valwraith weapons discharged in response, not the lethal compression beams from earlier, but something that looked like coherent light made solid. Mercenaries dropped, convulsing but alive. Their nervous systems overloaded by technology Jacob didn't understand. Get down! He pulled Seraphine back into the cabin as rounds punched through the door frame where her head had been. Vektar moved with liquid speed, his team coordinating with silent efficiency to suppress the human forces without killing them. Within seconds, every mercenary lay twitching in the dirt, weapons scattered. All except Meridian, who'd used the chaos to reach the cabin's far side. He appeared in the doorway behind them, a pistol trained on Seraphine's back. Nobody moves. The alien comes with me, or I put rounds through her spine until her fancy armor fails. His voice shook, but his grip looked steady. I've got funding for this project, authorization from people you can't touch, and enough lawyers to bury any charges. She's worth more than all our lives combined. Jacob's rifle leaned against the wall 3 feet away. Too far. His pistol was in his waistband, but drawing would get Seraphine shot. He met her eyes and saw her calculating the same math, saw her tail coiling to strike despite the impossible angle. She's a person, not property, Jacob said, buying seconds he didn't know how to use. She's the key to technologies that will change everything. Meridian's finger tightened on the trigger. Medicine, transportation, weapons systems, whatever moral high ground you're standing on doesn't mean shit compared to that kind of power. Seraphine moved. Her tail whipped backward with shocking speed, wrapping around Meridian's gun hand and yanking upward. The pistol fired into the ceiling as Jacob dove for his rifle, but Meridian had a backup plan. He'd triggered something, a dead man's switch, and the propane system Jacob had rigged earlier roared to life. Not an explosion, but a massive leak flooding the cabin with gas. The Valwraith burst through the front door. Vectar grabbed Seraphine while two others hauled Jacob and Meridian outside before the concentration reached critical mass. They cleared the porch as the cabin's interior became a death trap, one spark away from immolation. Meridian struggled in Valwraith grip, still screaming about authorization and legal protection. Vectar silenced him with a gesture that looked casual but left the human unconscious. Then the commander turned his attention back to Seraphine and Jacob, his tail moving in patterns that suggested intense internal debate. "Your attachment to this human is genuine," Vectar said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." Seraphine had positioned herself between Jacob and Vectar again, her tail extended protectively across Jacob's chest. "He risked everything to free me. He showed me that surviving is not the same as living. Your protocols would eliminate him for that gift. I will not permit it." Jacob felt blood soaking through his shirt. He'd caught a grazing shot during the firefight without noticing, adrenaline masking the pain. Seraphine saw it the same moment Vectar did, and her skin blazed crimson. True alarm, not the combat red of her armor. She dropped to her knees beside Jacob, hands pressing against the wound while her tail wrapped around his arm with crushing strength. No, you do not get to die after everything." Her voice broke on the words, her careful Valwraith composure shattering. "Vectar, please. Your medical technology can save him. I will testify. I will return. I will accept any consequence. But please do not let him die because I was too slow." Vectar watched her desperate display with an expression Jacob couldn't parse. Finally, the commander's tail settled into a pattern that looked almost gentle. "Bring him aboard. Our medical facilities will stabilize him." He paused as his team moved to comply. "Seraphine, your attachment violates every protocol we maintain. But your testimony regarding human diversity, both the cruelty of your captor and the compassion of your rescuer, may be precisely what the Council needs to understand that this species cannot be judged uniformly. That emotional capacity is not exclusively a weakness to be exploited." They carried Jacob to the ship on a stretcher that felt like floating on solid light. Seraphine never left his side, her hand gripping his even when the medical team needed her to step back. He drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments, her voice arguing with technicians in her own language, the hum of equipment that felt alive against his skin, the warmth of her tail curled around his ankle like an anchor to the waking world. When Jacob surfaced fully, he was in a recovery bay that looked grown rather than built, organic curves and soft bioluminescent light. Seraphine sat beside him, her armor fully retracted to reveal violet skin that seemed to glow with health. Her white hair cascaded freely, and her tail traced lazy patterns in the air that spoke of relief. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough. "I will always stay." She leaned down to press her forehead against his, the gesture achingly familiar now. "Vectar has agreed to let me remain on Earth as an unofficial liaison, to teach his observers about human emotional complexity, and to provide testimony about what sustained isolation does to Valwraith psychology." Her smile carried equal parts joy and uncertainty. "I choose this, Jacob. I choose feeling over detachment. I choose you, if you will have someone whose people consider her compromised." Jacob's hand found her face, his rough fingers tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone. "I'm compromised too, then, have been since the day I found you." They returned to the cabin site weeks later, after Jacob recovered, and after countless debriefings with both Valwraith observers and carefully selected human officials. The structure stood repaired. Valwraith technology had sealed the gas damage and reinforced the foundations with materials that would outlast centuries. A gift, Vectar had said, though his tone suggested he still found the entire situation professionally disturbing. Inside, Jacob had finally turned the photographs face up. Emma and Sophie smiled from their frames, frozen in moments of joy he could look at now without drowning. Seraphine studied them with respectful curiosity, her tail swaying gently. "They would have liked you," Jacob said quietly. "Sophie would have asked 10,000 questions about your tail, and Emma would have wanted to know everything about Valwraith family structures. I think I would have liked them also." Seraphine traced the frame with one four-fingered hand. Love does not end with death, it transforms, becomes part of who we carry forward. She turned to face him fully. You taught me that. Grief and hope can coexist. Honoring the past and choosing the future are not contradictions. Jacob wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling the warmth of her skin and the subtle pulse of her bio-armor responding to his touch. Her tail curled contentedly around them both as they watched sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and violet. Two damaged souls who'd found healing in the least likely place. Their future held complications neither could fully predict: political tensions between species, cultural differences that would take lifetimes to fully bridge, the weight of being symbols of something larger than themselves. But they would face it together. Proof that love could exist across species boundaries, not by erasing differences, but by honoring them. In the end, that was enough.